talk about fish farming and aquatic production of our food. So most of the world is getting their substance from fish. They're getting at least a portion of the protein that they are eating every day from our oceans, and it's important that we understand the implications of that. So we need to talk about aquatic food production. Now, when we talk about our oceans, we talk about water, we're going to talk mostly about the food that we can get, but what else is on our continental shelf that maybe we want to protect, that we need, that we like? Nothing? What about oil? Oh, yeah, that's under there too. The continental shelf is defined as the area where the continent extends under the water. We used to say that our exclusive economic zone was the continental shelf. So when I say exclusive economic zone, this is the area in which we have extreme rights to all of the oil that lays under, to all of the fish that swim above. The problem with using the continental shelf as our exclusive economic zone is the distance of that shelf differs depending on where you are. If you are off the East Coast, the Grand Banks, it runs about 300 miles from the low tide mark out to the ocean. If you're in the Bering Straits, that whole area is shallow, and now we're going to fight with Russia because it's shallow on their end too, and we're pretty close. There was, in 1988, a woman who swam from the coast of Alaska to the coast of Russia. It's about 2 miles. Yeah, really cold water. She did it as a like, hey, look, we're close enough to be friends during the Cold War. Yeah. But off the coast of Santa Barbara, the continental shelf drops off about 3 feet offshore. And then it drops to the abyssal plain, rises back up at Santa Cruz Island, and then drops again. So if we were using the continental shelf off the coast of Santa Barbara, it means that foreign vessels would have rights to our minerals and our fish 3 miles off the coast. That's not great, right? We don't want China drilling for oil 3 miles off of Santa Barbara. So thankfully, in 1982, the UN got together and said, no, we need a constant distance. We need to put some standard to this. And in 1982, we established the exclusive economic zone as 200 nautical miles from the low tide mark. They take, on average, the lowest point tide, and they extend out 200 miles. That means for 200 miles off our coast, all of the oil that is there belongs to the United States. All of the fish that are currently swimming there belong to the United States. No one can come in and use those resources. That's important because when we talk about the ocean, it is the largest tragedy of the commons that exists. And by saying we have this 200 nautical miles, we're saying we have our private pond. If you remember from that activity we did, we have our own private area that we can fish. We can also regulate how that fishing is done within those 200 miles. And some countries regulate their fisheries really heavily, the United States being one of them. And some countries barely regulate fisheries at all, China being one of them. The United Nations Convention on Laws of the Sea, you guys, if you're within the 200 nautical miles, you are under the conventions of the country that you are in. Really, we're going to enforce our laws in our territorial waters, which are 13.8 nautical miles. Once you get outside 13.8 nautical miles, if you're on a cruise ship and you're 18, hey, guess what? You are now legal to drink. If you're within 13.8 miles, you're in the United States territory. You're not until you're 21. Interesting law. If you are a boat coming in, once you get 13.8 miles from our shore, you are under United States laws and regulations. Once you're outside that, you are under the laws and the regulations of the flag that you sail under. So where is your ship registered? Those are the laws that you are required to enforce. How many cruise ships are registered in the United States? 0. Why? Because if you register a cruise ship in the United States, you are held to the standards of the United States, which means you are held to the workers' rights of the United States. Minimum wage, hours, all of that stuff. If you register your boat in Panama, you are held to the regulations and minimum wage of Panama, which is why cruise ship workers can work 16-hour days for like $3 an hour. Once you pass outside the territorial waters, it is fair game, but it is governed under UNESCO's. Continuous zone is a little bit further. It's another 13.8 miles. So you hit the territorial waters, and then 13.8 miles from the territorial waters out, we are contiguous zone. This is where we can patrol. So we can have our Coast Guard patrolling that area. We can legally board boats within this zone and look for illegal immigrants and for illegal drugs. One of the ways that they are trying to smuggle drugs into the country now is with little submarines, little narco subs that they stuff full of cocaine and they bring up the coast. Within the contiguous zone, we can stop any vessel and board it and search it. And then our EEZ, our exclusive economic zone, says only we are allowed to fish and drill for oil or minerals within this 200 nautical miles. So it's just a picture of it to show you. 90% of all commercial fishing is saltwater, only about 10% is freshwater, and over 1 billion people are employed by these fisheries. So that means either directly on a boat catching the fish, or it's in the processing of the fish, the canning of the fish, it's in supplying those fisheries. So if you think about Alaska, a lot of the cities along the coast there exist solely because they've got the crab fishing boats that come in. And so everyone that works there essentially works to supply those fishermen. The hotels are there and the airports are there solely to bring the fishermen in and out of that area. So over 1 billion people get their livelihood from these fisheries. So it's important that we maintain them not only for biological biodiversity, not only as a food source, but also as an economic source of money. 3 billion people get 20% of their daily protein from fish. The rest of the people in the world are getting about 15% from fish. Fish is high in protein, vitamins, omega acids, saturated fat. Fish is a great source of protein. It's a great source of food and vitamins. It's a great source of nutrition, so we want to maintain our fisheries. We know, though, however, that 70% of the world's fisheries are in decline because of poor management. Because we are taking more fish faster than they can reproduce, this fishery is going away. One of the biggest impacts we've seen is on salmon fisheries. There have been years where we haven't even opened up salmon fishing for commercial fishing in the United States. There have been years when it's been open for 5 hours and the quota is caught because the quota is so low. So we know that we are fishing species to extinction, essentially. We got too good at fishing, and a lot of our developments in fishing came out of World War II. So the technology we developed in World War II to find submarines, we then, in times of peace, have turned it on our fish. The big one here being sonar. It used to be, if you were a commercial fisherman, you would go out and you'd throw your nets where historically you've caught fish before, and you just hope that there are fish in that area again. Now, you have technology on board that is sonar that you cruise around the surface, and it's basically taking a picture of what's below. And you can dial in on that school of fish, and you are ensured that every time you throw out your nets, you are catching something. That kind of takes the fairness out of it, right? The fish don't have the ability to detect your boat or your net, so we've gotten too good at it. We now also do plane fishing. where there is a plane that flies above the commercial fishing boat and is able to spot the dark shadows of these big schools of fish. That came from the 50s. Our boats have become bigger and more efficient. It used to be that our commercial fishing boats were small and you only had so much capacity for fuel and food for your crew, and that limited how long you could be out, which therefore limited how much fishing you could do. It used to be that you caught a fish and you had to store it on ice on your boat, and that ice would only last for so long. And so you'd have to get your fish back to shore to be sold before the fish went bad. Now we have factory fish boats that go out. This is a boat that literally has a canning facility on it. So in the Bering Strait, there are these huge, like, think container ship size ships that pull in millions of fish at a time, and there are people that work down below that as the fish are coming in out of the net, they're being gutted, filleted, and then canned. You don't have to go back to shore, right? And because you're canning this fish, or you're turning it into dog food or whatever, right there on site, you can catch more. So we've gotten too good at fishing, and we are overfishing because of it. The idea of bycatch is catching a species of fish that you are not seeking. So the way that we fish is you have the mother boat here, right? And you've got a big net that's up on the mother boat. You drop a piece of the net in, attached to a little motorboat, and that motorboat goes out into a big circle, dragging the net with it, and brings this piece of net back, and then they just haul that net in and catch anything that's behind the boat. Obviously, it's not going to be just the species that they're looking for. We know through studies that 50% of what is caught and released, so brought up on the boat, not the species of crab we're looking for, not the species of fish that we are legally allowed to catch right now, throw it overboard, 50% of that dies. By the way, if you do sport fishing, that's become big, is the idea of catch and release. You go down to Cabo and you're going to go for marlin. That entire industry has become catch and release. So you pay a couple $100, go out on a boat, you hook into a marlin, you spend about 2 hours dragging this poor fish onto the boat, and then you take the hook out, take your picture, and you throw it back. 50% of those die. And they die because of the trauma of those 2 hours of trying to get it on the boat. They die of the trauma of having the hook, so they think infection. Fish don't have antibiotics. They have an open wound now. And they're just tired. So we know that 50% of bycatch of catch and release die. Now, that's still 50% surviving, as opposed to what it used to be in Cabo, where every marlin that you caught, you brought aboard and then killed and ate. But it's not the best practice still. Bycatch became a big kind of thing in the 1980s. In the 1980s, we used to use gill nets to catch tuna. Again, a net that was put out from the back of the boat, and any fish or anything that got caught in that net got dragged on the boat. The problem with gill netting for tuna is that dolphins are usually found in the same area as tuna. And so the dolphins were getting caught in the net, and dolphins need to breathe air, and they're being basically drowned by the nets. We also see that happening with our sea turtles. In the United States, our nets are now designed so that we limit the amount of mammals or sea turtles that we catch in those nets to kind of decrease that bycatch, but bycatch is still a big problem. Maximum sustainable yield, MSY. Maximum sustainable yield is a calculation that the U.S. Fish and Game do to determine the quota, or the maximum amount of fish that can be brought in during any fishing season. The idea here is that we leave enough fish in the ocean that they can reproduce so that next season there is still a fishery. Sustainable yield is the annual growth in recruitment minus the annual death and immigration. Essentially, you have, before a season opens, and when I say a season, you all need to realize that there is a salmon fishing season. There is a king crab fishing season where they open up the fishery for only a month or two, and then they close it again. That's done to allow these organisms to reproduce. So before the season opens, if you are a marine ecologist, you're employed by Fish and Game, you go out and you get a population count. You sample for population. What's the problem with me sampling for population? How accurate were your population counts? Right? And you could see people. Now we're talking about fish or crab that are in the ocean that I'm going to go out and sample for population, and I hope that A, those crab or fish are equally distributed, which by the way they're not, and B, that I'm at the right place at the right time at the right depth, that my population counts are accurate. Almost never are. When we get our population counts, we then decrease on the side of the fish. So we establish our quota due to this calculation and our population counts, and then we take that and say, oh, we're going to leave 25% of that number on the table so that we err on the side of the fish that the fish are still there. It's not a great practice, but it's all we've got, essentially.
Let's say we have a stock of fish, a population of fish, and we see that the catches are steadily falling every year, and it's probably from fishing too much. Or maybe the catch isn't falling, it's staying about the same from year to year. But we notice that the number of boats on the stock is increasing, and the size of the boats is increasing, and the technology they're using is becoming more advanced. The amount of effort that seems to be going into fishing is increasing, but the catches are not. If there's more effort being put into fishing, but there's not more fish being caught, it's a pretty clear sign that the population is probably declining. This exact thing happened to the Grand Banks cod off the eastern coast of Canada. The scientists who monitored the fish population calculated the fish stock was on the decline, but the policymakers saw that there were still high catches from the fishermen and thought, scientists with their math and their hipster glasses. But the stock was indeed overfished, and the catches weren't changing because of the increased technology. Because nothing was done, the population continued to decline, and eventually the catches did too. As of now, there's been a ban on fishing cod for over 20 years because the population has been so low. Increasing effort without increasing catches is a sign of an unhealthy population. Anyways, it may be clear that fishing needs to decrease on a particular stock, but to what degree? In this video, we're going to look at what we should be aiming for in a fishing quota. First, let's try to model how fish populations behave. Let's say this line represents fish population. This axis is population. And this axis is time or something. Let's say there's not a lot of fish in the beginning, so we're down here. They're going to reproduce, but at first, their population isn't going to rise that fast because there's not a lot of fish reproducing. As their population increases, more and more fish reach sexual maturity and the population rises faster, but then growth slows down as food and habitat space becomes scarce. And then eventually the death rate equals the birth rate. This is the highest population this particular environment can fit, the carrying capacity. In reality, ecosystems are dynamic and this level is always changing. For example, if some food sources are depleted or the fish find other food sources or if they move around. And this is no small effect, and when setting quotas we can't ignore that. But for our model here, we're just going to treat it as constant. So what this is showing is that down here when the population is low, the growth rate is low, and also when the population is high, the growth rate is low. Somewhere in the middle is where the fast growth is happening. Okay, let's take this same information, but model the population growth rate as it changes with the population. We're assuming the population is the only thing that affects the growth rate. So when the population is 0, the growth rate is 0 because there's no fish to reproduce. At low populations, the growth rate is low. But as the population rises, then reproduction rises. At some point, food and habitat are starting to limit growth. Reproduction rates are still high, but they're starting to decline. The growth rate slows and slows until the carrying capacity is reached. Okay, so this is basically showing the same thing as this other graph. When the population is in the middle, the growth is fast. When the population is low or when it's high, the growth is slower. But what this graph can show us is what amounts of fish we can take and how it affects the population. If the fish population was here, then the fish is growing by this amount. So we know we can take that amount, and by next time the population wouldn't have changed. If the population was still here but we took below that line, then next period the population would be greater. If we keep taking that amount, the population will grow and grow and grow until it reaches here. Now we're at the growth line for this fish. If we take this much again, the population isn't going to change. If the population were here but we took this much fish, then we're taking more than that period's amount of growth, and next time the fish population will be lower. If we still take that much the next period, then it will be lower and lower and lower. What I'm calling the period will depend entirely on the ecology of the fish and requires a bit more insight. For simplicity, we're just sort of assuming that it's the growth in between fishing seasons and it only depends on the population of the fish. If you take a catch below the line, the population will rise by next period. If you take above the line, the population will fall by next period. Catches along the line won't change the population. So if you take an amount of fish in these areas here, the catch is sustainable. The population will change, but only until it reaches the line. In this way, the line is an equilibrium for the catches. But if the amount of fish is taken in this area, then the population will decline. Keep taking in those areas and the population might collapse. So it's always safer to be fishing when the population is high. If the population is low, we'll want to try to take an amount from below the line so the population is safely given room to grow. Okay, so based on this, how much should we be taking? Well, of the catches along the line, this point here allows us to take the maximum amount of fish each period. This is the maximum sustainable yield. Taking any higher will result in a declining population, so we could try to take a little bit less when the population is good, just for safety. I think this was actually an old basis for setting fishing quotas, but it's pretty shallow. I mean, maybe it would be fine if our goal was to take as much fish out of the water as fast as we can. But that's not our goal. Our goal, or rather the fisherman's goal, and fisherwomen, who will hereby be referred to collectively as fishermen, fishermen will want to make as much money as they can for as long as they can. So our goal is to maximize the economic rent from fishing and to do it sustainably for as long as possible. If you're new to the term economic rent, don't worry about it. Just think of it as profit for now, the difference between the costs and the revenue. There are some important differences between rent and profit, which is why we're bringing it up. But for here, if you just think of it as profit, you'll do just fine. But I'm going to call it rent. Anyway, so let's change this graph to reflect that we're trying to maximize the amount of money made. Instead of looking at what amount of fish is taken from period to period sustainably, let's change this to what amount of money can be made sustainably from period to period. The line changes from what catches are sustainable to what earnings are sustainable. We're going to keep the line the same shape. You can look at it like it's just whatever fish was caught was then sold. And the price of fish isn't ever changing. Okay, now this is a revenue curve, the total revenue curve from the amount of fish caught. For the bottom axis, we have population, but we're assuming the population is only changing because of what we're doing, that is, how much effort we're putting into fishing. So let's track that instead, and change this axis to fishing effort. This is how the population will be experienced by the fishing industry on a cost and revenue basis. If the population is low, then they have to put more effort into finding and catching fish, because there's less fish to find. There's less fish in every net. Effort is a term that refers to a few things. It could refer to how long people are fishing, or how many people are fishing, or how advanced the fishing gear is. It's about how much equipment is on the fish stock. So more boats fishing, more time spent fishing, more advanced equipment, more efficient techniques are all increasing the amount of effort. While money and fish catch were directly related, effort and population are actually inversely related. As the population decreases, more fishing effort is required to find out where they are, and there's less fish in every net. Or we could look at it like the more effort put into fishing, the lower the population will be. But we want low effort over here and have the effort increasing. So we're going to switch the axis so that high fish population is here and low population is over here as fishing effort increases. So look at it like this. We've come to a new stock, the population is high because we haven't touched it yet, and the more effort that's put into fishing, the lower the overall population gets. Okay, so now this graph is what are the sustainable earnings when certain amounts of fishing effort are put in. Let's say we come to a new stock at the beginning when the population is at carrying capacity, the equilibrium catch is 0. Right? The population is as high as it can be. There's no net growth. So there's no amount of fish that we can take without affecting the population. If we put in some effort, the equilibrium catch increases. We freed up some room for the fish to grow and the growth rate increases. So the equilibrium catch increases. But it's...
Y'all get that? Okay. I'm not going to show the whole video. The idea of tragedy of the commons is the same whether we're talking about minerals, whether we're talking about farming, or whether we're talking about fish. The idea that everyone wants to make the most profit, to harken back to the video, the idea that everyone wants to feed their people and there is limited fish out there is a tragedy of the commons.
Fish are delicious. I really like fish. There are at least a dozen recipes for fish, and hunting them is an important part of human culture all over the world. Fish are also dumb. I mean, they seem to be easy to catch. Oh, what's this? A fresh and convenient meal dangling in front of my uh-oh. Hey guys, let's swim in a group. It'll confuse predators, and each of us will have a less likely chance of uh-oh. I've been reading about them, and they're actually not as dumb as they seem. If they happen to survive capture, they learn from it and are better at avoiding capture in the future. Some build and remember dominance hierarchies. Others know how to smash clams against rocks to get the insides. You know, they just seem to be as intelligent as any other animal. Shouldn't really come as a surprise. I don't know, maybe we just don't notice because they're under a bunch of water, and they always have a stupid expression. A good chunk of the vegetarians I've met eat fish. That's how little respect they get. Anyways, none of that matters. The point was, fishing has gotten too easy. Not that being a fisher is easy, mind you. It's just that now people can take fish out of the water faster than the fish can reproduce, which can hurt the population. Less fish means less fish reproducing, and their productivity can decline, which ultimately means less profits for fishermen the next time. And this is the problem we're here to look at in this series. How to make sure a population of fish is used sustainably so you can use it forever. One of the most important problems for the long-term use of a fishery is the problem with open access conditions on a common pool resource. A common pool resource is a resource like fish or trees. It's rivalrous, meaning if one person takes some fish, it prevents someone else from taking that same bunch of fish. So luckily, fish is renewable. You can take some and the fish will reproduce. Take too much though, and their productivity might go down, since there's less fish laying eggs and reproducing. If there's only one person fishing a particular stock of fish, they're probably not going to take so much that they're hurting the stock for the next season, or for 5 seasons from now. If they do, they're only hurting their own access to the fish in the future. Better to put in less effort now and always ensure there's something for later. But the other trait that makes it a common pool resource is that it's difficult or costly to stop other people from using it, right? Especially in the ocean, it's pretty hard to draw a territory around a certain body of water and then police and enforce it too, at least compared to land. So multiple people using the resource is pretty much always the case for fisheries. If one person in the group notices they're all fishing too much, that person could try to take less to preserve the stock for the future. If they do, someone else will probably just take more, or other fishermen will enter the fishery to take that extra share. An individual working alone has an incentive to fish less now to preserve fishing for later, but an individual in a group can't do that because someone else can just use what he's leaving. This is the problem with open access. They call it the tragedy of the commons. It's incorrectly named because it's not necessarily a problem with common pool resources. A group of people can work together and behave like an individual, solving the problem. The problem is when it's treated as open access. Open access meaning there are no rules, or nobody is following the rules. So people are just racing to take as much as they can. Working as hard as they can trying to get as much fish for themselves, they're actually hurting themselves compared to if they were working as a team. This is why they call it a tragedy. Each fisher is only thinking about themselves, hurting the fishery as a whole, but ironically, they're hurting themselves too. This has been a bigger problem over the last 100 years or so as the demand for fish exploded from the population boom. Meeting the new demand is new technology that makes fishing cheaper. There's GPS navigation to plot out and find fishing spots easily, and sonar to target the specific places where they are in the water. They have these deep sea factory ships, which are called factory ships because they put the factory on the ship. Instead of trying to keep the fish fresh and bring them onto shore for processing, they process them right away and then freeze them, all while still on the ship. It allows them to go out farther and stay out for weeks. These kinds of boats can exacerbate the open access issue. Fishermen fishing close to where they live, the inshore or artisanal fishermen if you like, can see the benefits of working together and might form a little fishing government relatively easily. They know if they don't, they will be in a bad way in the future, hurting themselves and their children and their neighbors. But fishers with large factory ships, the offshore or large-scale commercial fishers, their ships can travel farther and deal with bad weather easier, so if they deplete a stock, they can move on to another without being affected as much. In this series, we're going to look at management strategies to preserve fishing long term. In the next video, we're going to look closer at the problem with open access and find out what is the optimal amount of fishing effort for long term.
All right. So that's the idea of Tragedy of the Commons Fish Edition. There have been wars fought over fisheries. So in the 1970s, Iceland said, nope, all of the cod around Iceland belongs to us and no one else can have it. The British were not thrilled with this idea because they like their fish and chips, and so there was a skirmish that developed. In 1994, the British and the French fought with the Spanish over the rights of the Biscayne Bay. No one could figure out who had exclusive economic rights to that bay, which is a great fishery. And, oh my gosh, Canada. Peaceful Canada. Canada that doesn't get involved in anything, actually fired upon a Spanish fishing boat and captured the crew after sinking the boat over halibut. So this whole idea of a common resource and protecting our fishing zones is actually a big deal. Because we are running out of wild caught fish, we are turning to fish farming. And fish farming is just like farming any other animal. So instead of letting these things be free in the ocean, we take their babies and we put them in concrete pools and we raise them to adulthood. And then we don't have to go out and catch them. We don't have to hope that they're somewhere that we're going to be able to find them. They're in the pool. Let me ask you this. Has anyone had farm-raised salmon before? Do you notice a taste between that and wild-caught salmon? Yeah. Farm-raised fish tends to be fattier. Let's think about why. When you eat meat, you are eating the muscle of the animal. So when you eat cow, you are eating the muscle of the cow. When you eat fish, you are eating the muscle of the fish. If you are a wild salmon, you are born up a stream, you swim all the way to the ocean, you swim around the ocean for a couple of years, and then you swim back upstream. You're doing a lot of work, right? If you are a farm-raised salmon, you're in a pool the size of this classroom and you're just lazily swimming in a circle. Farm-raised fish are like couch potatoes, whereas wild-caught fish are more like cross-country athletes. The meat of a farm-raised fish is going to be fattier. By the way, that's why we like veal. That's why we like some of like the Wagyu cows, because they're put in contained areas so they don't develop the muscle and they get kind of fatty, and that's what makes meat taste good in like beef. But it's not great when we're talking about fish. The United States Department of Agriculture, they are the people who regulate the food that you eat, have said that there are 8 fish that could be successfully farmed and sold in the United States. White sea bass, walleye, rainbow trout, Arctic char, tuna, and salmon. By the way, if you're a sport fisher in this area and you fish in the creeks or the lakes, all of that fish is farm raised. So they raise it in a farm, load it onto a tanker truck, and then stock the lakes and the rivers. And you can actually go in the sports page of the newspaper and find out what day they're stocking like Holy Gin Canyon. And then obviously the next day is the day you want to go fish because that's when there's a ton of fish in the river. All of that is farm raised. If you drive up to Mammoth, watch the signs on the side of the 395 as you get into the Mammoth area. There are a ton of fish farms in that area once you get past Independence. So this is big industry. There are some downsides to it. The biggest downside is habitat loss. If we're going to build a fish farm, we got to build it somewhere. In the Philippines, they're taking out mangrove forests. Mangroves provide an ecological service. They are a nursery for a ton of baby organisms. They act as flood protection. So when storm surges come in, the roots of the mangrove kind of slow down the velocity of that water, and they purify the water. Well, in the Philippines, to raise their shrimp in farms, they are taking out these forests. There is the idea of pollution. Think about what your fish tank looks like after a week or two if you don't have a filter running, or what that filter looks like. Now, multiply that by a fish tank the size of this room with 200 salmon in it. That poop's got to go somewhere. That poop is high in nutrients. It could lead to eutrophication. And then there's the idea of invasive species. We are not always farming the fish in their native habitat. We're taking them somewhere else to do it, somewhere that's convenient for us. And if that fish escapes, it takes with it then the possibility of becoming an invasive species. We also genetically engineer a lot of our farmed fish, and if those fish get out, They mate with native fish, and now we have that genetically engineered trait in the wild. Atlantic salmon has been a very successful fish farming area. I'm not going to show the video, but if you watch it, they'll talk about how we've done it well. There is a trade-off between fish farming and keeping the native population high. If we eat only farm-raised salmon, the native salmon get to thrive because we're not capturing them. If we eat only farm-raised trout, native trout don't get captured. But there's trade-offs. There is this idea of aquapods, which is kind of cool. One of the avenues that you can take environmental science to is environmental engineering, which I think is kind of interesting. Engineering to solve environmental problems. So how can we take this big issue of, hey, we want to farm raise our fish, but we don't want pollution. How could I create something that would solve that problem? This idea of aquapods is one of the solutions.
The oceans are in trouble. For years now we've been scouring them and scraping them for the seafood that we crave, and we can't squeeze any more blood out of that stone. We have to move towards more sustainable, responsible ways of getting the seafood that we all love to eat. So we're moving deeper and further offshore into open ocean mariculture, which offers tremendous potential. So that's what the Velella project is all about. It's about marrying together revolutionary technology that's going to allow us to grow fish literally with no footprint on the oceans in a drifter cage, a cage that is untethered, that's moving around in the eddies in the back of the big island. And we're going to marry that together with more responsible feeds, more sustainable proteins and oils, such as US soybeans, which provide us with soybean meal or soy protein concentrates, and also with soy oils, and with other agricultural proteins and oils as well, so that we can soften our footprint on the seas, and so that we can grow this industry in the way that we need to feed 9 billion people with great tasting sashimi. So that's what the Velella project is striving towards. It's tremendously exciting, and we're really pleased with the partnership that's come together to help us make this a reality.
So these pods are free floating in the ocean. There is another company that's really cool where they have these pods and they fill them in the United States with the baby fish, and the pods have a little motor and a GPS tracker, and these pods then move to wherever that fish is going to be sold. So let's say Spain buys that pod of fish. That pod will then move through the oceans and actually take itself to the coast of Spain and dock up somewhere. As it's moving, those fish are growing, maturing. The poop is being spread out along the oceans. And then it's its own shipment. So you're not using fossil fuels to grow and mature them and then to ship them and to freeze them. They arrive at the dock in Spain, mature, full-sized fish, fresh, ready to eat. So this is one of those possible cool ideas that is out there. These pods also become like floating reefs. So a lot of like other organisms will attach to it. And so they have their own biodiversity that develops. I'm going to end us with this idea of sustainable fish. This is put out by Monterey Bay Aquarium, and they have categorized your fish as best, good, and avoid. The best fish are the fish that are caught sustainably and that have high populations. These are the fish that are not going to go extinct because of our fishing practices. These are the ones that you want on your table. The avoid ones are ones where the population is very low, the fisheries are polluting, and they're not very sustainable in their practices. Oh yeah, and things like Chilean bass and bluefin tuna are usually pretty high in mercury because of bioaccumulation. So you don't want to eat a lot of them either.
This is a fish. Some fish are wild, which means a fisherman caught them out of the ocean. Other fish are farmed, which means they were raised in an enclosed aquaculture system, like a cow farm, but in the water. And there are endless fish in the sea, right? Wrong. Let's start with the wild ones. Wild fish are being caught in a way that cannot last. 85% of the world's fisheries are currently being overtaxed, meaning wild fish are being caught at a faster rate than they can reproduce. Here's another problem that comes up with wild fish. Some fishing methods catch all kinds of additional sea life that end up dying as a result. This is called bycatch. For instance, trawls get dragged along the ocean floor, disrupting the ecosystem and catching sea turtles and unwanted fish. Long lines snag tons of innocent bycatch as well. These methods are definitely not sustainable. A wild fish is sustainable if it's caught in a way that doesn't threaten the long-term survival of its species or the ecosystem it's a part of. Hook and line fishing, harpooning, and some uses of traps are often more sustainable methods of catching fish. With these methods, bycatch is minimal and unwanted fish can be released. Okay, so now let's talk about fish farms. Seems like they're happy places, right? Well, not always. Some farm-raised fish are from poorly run fish farms. They pollute the oceans with their waste. They also risk releasing their fish into the wild, and since farm fish are often genetically different from wild fish, this can change the wild populations and upset the natural ecosystem. A sustainable farm is careful about keeping their fish separate from wild populations, what they feed their fish, and what they're putting in the ocean. So, you're partial to your sushi, but you don't want to be a selfish jerk. What can you do? Well, if you're going to eat fish, make sure it's sustainable. Sustainability is on a fish-by-fish basis, so being responsible takes a little bit of work, but it's worth it. Here's how you find sustainable fish without having to memorize a long list of options. First, check the label. For farmed fish, look for the Aquaculture Stewardship Council logo. And for wild fish, look for the Marine Stewardship Council logo. Next, try to shop at supermarkets that only stock fish from responsible farms and fisheries. The best options are Whole Foods, Safeway, Wegmans, and Trader Joe's. Finally, download Monterey Bay Aquarium's app, Seafood Watch. Then when you shop, you can enter the name of any fish and know whether or not to buy it. This is a sustainable fish. Let's keep it that way.
All right, guys, that is the end of lecture. Do me a favor, put your Chromebooks away.